to call your attention today to Psalms 3. Psalms 3, verses 3 and verses 4. And I want to share an encouraging message or a word from God that will encourage us in the times in which we are now facing. Psalms 3, verse 3 says, it says, "But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I've cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of the holy hills, Selah. I laid me down and slept, and I wake, for the Lord sustained me. I will be not afraid of 10,000 of people that have set themselves against me around about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies upon the cheekbone, and thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people, Selah." I want to encourage the people of God with this message entitled Reassurance in the Midst of a Crisis. I want to encourage you today with this message, reassurance in the midst of a crisis. My brothers and sisters, the time of our text, David is at a very interesting place in his life. Because David, now at the time of our text, he is running from Absalom. His men, his friends have turned against him. And now David is in a fight for his life. What I like about David in this text, that David shows us how we ought to respond in the midst of what we are going through. That David teaches us as believers how we ought to respond in the midst of a crisis and a catastrophe that we are facing in our lives. Because so often we become cynical, and we have become spectacle, and we have become downright negative about what we are facing in our lives. Here it is in the text. David gives us an optimistic view to a pessimistic situation. Because can I suggest today that God always reassures us of his power and his love in times of uncertainty. And that's a sermon right there in one sentence, that God always reassures us of his power and his love in times of uncertainty. Because God has a way of wrapping his arms around us and reassuring us that he has us right in the midst of whatever we are going through. Because that's the reason why you can smile when you feel like crying. That's why you can hold on when you feel like giving up. That's why you can go through whatever you have to go through, because God's got you in the midst of what you are going through. And so here it is in the text, beloved. The first thing we notice in the text and see about David in the text is, first of all, we see David's confidence in God. That's right. We see David's confidence in God. Because please keep in mind that externally, David is going through hell. Because remember, at the time of our text, his son is trying to kill him. His followers have turned against him, and now David is living life on the run. But can I tell you, internally, David is at peace, because he understands that God is bigger than whatever situation he is facing. that David in the text, as David takes inventory of what he's going through in verse number 1, he says, I understand that people are going against me, and that number is increasing daily. He says, I understand that I'm being taunted and I've been made a mockery for trusting in God. But notice, if you will, in the text, that David turns his focus and he turns his attention from his problem and starts to focus on God and what God is able to do in his life. Because can I suggest today that the direction of your focus determines the peace of your situation? Can I say it again? That the direction of your focus determines the peace of your situation. So could it be this morning that the lack of peace that you have in your life is simply because you're focused on the wrong thing? Although David has a lot going on in his life, notice that his focus is on God, because please know that David's confidence in God is stemmed from his focus. Can I say it again? That David's confidence in God is stemmed from his focus. And so the question I want to raise today, the question that I want to raise in your hearing is, what are you focusing on? The question I want to raise today is that what really has your attention? Because during this time of uncertainty, that during this time of unrest that we're going through as a nation, what has your attention? David says in the text, he says, my confidence, it comes from my Creator. David says, while I have a lot of things going on in my life, notice what he says there in verse number 3. He says, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. That notice in the text that when he uses this word shield, please understand that there were two types of shield in biblical days that were used in war. First of all, there was a full body length shield that was used to protect the full body. But the problem with this shield was that it limited mobility. And you could move like you really needed to move. But secondly, there was a torso length shield that was used for battles that were designed for hand-to-hand combat, in which they use spears and swords. And so the metaphor that David is using in this text, when he uses this word shield, he's simply saying that God is the promise of his protection. Because can I tell you today that the reason why you can endure whatever situation that you are facing, the reason why you can endure the problems of your life is because of God's protection. And this protection that David is talking about is not ADT. This protection that David is talking about is not Vivant, but this protection that while we are going through some difficult times in our lives, this protection that David is talking about is a 24-hour surveillance. That's why the hymn writer says, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And so not only does David in the text say that God was his shield, or that God was his protection, but then David says that God is the lifter of my head. It seems as if, beloved, that David has a flashback, and he recalls a time in his life when he was down and depressed. But now, because David is on the other side of the situation, now he's able to testify that God is the lifter of my head. Now he's able to testify what God was able to do for him. And because of what God did for David in his past, it allowed him to have confidence about God and his future. In other words, David simply said, if he's done it once, he can do it again. And that ought to be your encouragement to know that God has brought you through some tough situations, that God has brought you through some painful situations, that God has brought you out of situations that no one else thought you would make it out of. But guess what? Here you are, in good health. You're in your right mind simply because of what God was able to do for you. Here it is in the text. Not only does this text talk about David's confidence in God, but then this text talks about David's communication with God. This text talks about David's communication with God, because notice, if you will, there in verse number 4, it says, I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of the holy hills. David says, despite the crisis of what I'm going through, he says, I am reassured in the midst of my crisis because I've learned to talk to God. That word cried in the text, it carries the idea of calling out to God. It means to call out to God. And the reason why David is calling out to God, and the reason why David is calling the name of God, because David understands that when I call on God, that God always hears me. Lord, I thank you. David says that the reason why I call on God is because I know that he's going to hear me. And whenever God hears me, he always responds to me. Can I say it again? That whenever God hears me, he always responds to me. And this ought to be some encouragement for you and I while we are going through the crisis of our lives. David helps us to understand that when we are praying to God, that God has a way of answering us, that when we call on him, that when we learn how to talk to God, God knows how to talk back to us. Because it seems as if that David is in somewhat of an impossible situation. And people on the outside looking in may feel that David is now in a situation that is beyond God's reach of repair. There are some people that when they look in on David's situation, they will begin to surmise there's nothing else that David can do. But David helps us to understand today that when we learn how to call on God, that when we get down to our last dime, when we get to the lowest place in our lives, David says, that's when I've learned how to call on God. David says, when I learned how to call on him, he knows how to answer me. He knows how to hear me, because, can I suggest, don't allow the crisis in your life to cease your communication with God. Can I say it again? Don't allow the crisis in your life to cease your communication that you have with God. Because the challenge in the text is this, is that while we are going through whatever we are going through, while we are going through this crisis as a nation, this text simply helps us to understand that we need to simply tell God about it. And can I encourage you today that in spite of what you are going through, can I tell you, tell God about it? That the hurts that you are experiencing, the pain that you are enduring, the anxiety that you're trying to mask because you're trying to keep it all together. You're trying to make it seem as if everything is all right. But can I tell you today, what you ought to do is learn how to tell God about it. Because the good news is that when we learn how to tell God about our trials, the songwriter says that he will hear even our faintest cry. And then he's able to answer by and by. David says to us today, he says, because of the communication that I have with God, I'm able to lay down and go to sleep, but then I'm able to wake up because I know God is going to sustain me. There in verse number 5, he says, I lay me down and slept. I await, for the Lord sustaineth me. David simply says in the text, he says that God has a way of steadying you, because life has a way of knocking you down. Life has a way of knocking you around, but God has a way of steadying you. That the Lord has a way of giving you stability, and he's able to steady you even while you're standing on shaky ground. This text helps us to understand, beloved, that we see David's confidence in God. We see David's communication with God. But then lastly, we notice David's confession about God. Because David says in the text there in verse number 6, he says, because I have confidence in God. He says, because I've had communication with God, I've learned how to talk to God. He says, because of my confidence in God and my communication with God, he says there in verse number 6, he says, I will not be afraid. He says, I will not be afraid. I will not be scared of what I'm going through, because in order to make this statement, you have to have history with God. David says, because of of the confidence I have in God, because of the communication that I've had with God, he says I'm able to confess some things about God. And David says, while I'm going through, while I'm in the midst of this crisis, he says, I will not be afraid. Can I suggest today that when you've got history with God, you are able to confess the word of God about your situation. Because you've got history with God, you're able to confess that God is able to keep you in perfect peace. When you learn how to keep your mind stayed upon him. When you've got history with God, you are able to confess that weeping may endure for a night, but joy will come in the morning. And when you've got history with God, you are able to confess Romans 8:28 when it says, and we know all things are going to work together for the good of them that love God and to them who are the called according to his purpose. And so can I tell you today that while we are in this time of uncertainty, while we are in a situation when we don't know when things are going to get back to normal, can I suggest today that you can be reassured in the midst of your crisis because you have confidence in God. You can be reassured in the midst of your crisis because you have communication with God. But then lastly, you can be reassured in the midst of your crisis because of the confessions you have about God. And one thing that you ought to know is that God will take care of you. Be not dismayed. Whatever betides, God will. Oh, yes, he will. He will take care of you. God bless you.
You to the tree. Amazing.